Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. One of my children noticed this llama side table at Urban Outfitters, and I just love it, but it was very expensive and now it's out of stock, so it's out of my hands. And I thought I would try to draw some inspiration from it and see if I could make a llama side table. Let's go have some fun.
I decided to make the llama body out of cardboard. The llama body is not going to be structural. And the first step I did off camera, which was to make this prototype out of a very light cardboard. This is like an Amazon box cardboard. It's corrugated but light. And I just cut the shapes that I wanted, and it took a lot of fitting, so it took a lot of time. I would put some paper up to the llama, roughly cut out of the paper what I thought I wanted, and then cut it out of cardboard and keep modifying it until I had a piece that I felt looked right. So that's where this cardboard llama came from. And you can see that I have numbered the pieces because I'm pretty convinced that if I take it apart, I would never get it back together correctly again. So what I'm going to do is take this apart, trace each piece onto paper, and use that as my pattern on a much stiffer cardboard. So I disassembled this llama and I wrote down on the sort of main body piece the number for where each smaller piece should be inserted. And you can see that it's created by creating slots in the pieces that are inserted onto the main body piece and also slots on the main body piece. Once I had all of the pattern pieces, I cut them out of this very thick cardboard. And this cardboard is, I would say, more than twice as thick as an Amazon box. But if all you have is an Amazon box or a thinner cardboard box, I would say just double up the pieces. That's what I intended to do originally until I bought this table, which came in this really thick box. So I would say just cut 2 of each and glue them together. And there will be instructions in the description for how to get this pattern if you want to make a llama that looks like mine, or maybe you want to take the pattern and modify it to suit your own needs. So I traced the pattern onto the thick cardboard and then cut it out with a box cutter knife. Once the pieces were all cut out, I cut the slots in them so I could fit them together. And I started with smallish slots, and then I would fit them together and then modify the slot as needed so that it fit nicely. We're going to glue it anyway, so it's not really important if the slots aren't perfect. Once I had all the slots cut, I dry fit the entire llama together, except for the piece on the nose, which is going to have to be glued on. And then once it was dry fit, I just used white glue to glue it together. So this is just ordinary PVA or school glue. And you can see I just tried to get the glue on the inside of those slots. Now for the nose, that will need to be curved a little bit to fit the front. So I just sort of ran it over the edge of the table to bend it a little bit. And then because it's going to fit right on that thin edge of the cardboard, I used the white glue to glue it on, but I put some hot glue on either side to hold it in place while it dried. Now, as I mentioned, that cardboard body, though sturdy, is not structural. What is going to make up the structure of the table is 4 plungers from the Dollar Tree, and make sure you get the complete plunger, including the rubber part. And then one of these shelves. They sell different shelves at the Dollar Tree. Right now there are a lot of these smaller shelf sets. So it's 2 shelves and some sort of rope and some hardware for hanging them. So we're going to use 2 shelves and 4 plungers for the structural part of the llama. So for the plungers, the very ends of them are rounded, and in retrospect, because of the way I ended up constructing this, it might not be necessary to cut off the rounded part at the bottom. Originally, I thought that the legs were going to be straight up and down, and so I thought that I wanted the bottoms of these to be flat. But that didn't end up working. You'll see how I put it together, which was the sturdiest way I could find to put it together. So you might not need to cut off the ends. However, these 4 plungers are pretty even in length, although not perfectly even, so there's some variation. I found some other plungers that were wildly different in length, like by an inch or more different. So if you don't want to cut the ends, then I would say try to find plungers that are exactly the same length. You are going to leave the threaded part. So if you don't cut off the end, there's no cutting that you need to do. Now here are the shelves, and they are 6.7 by 5.2 inches, or 17 by 13.2 centimeters, I think. And we're going to use both of them. You can discard the hardware for use somewhere else. And we're going to leave one of them, but for the other, we're going to drill holes, and our legs are going to fit through those holes. So I just made a template for that, and that is going to be available with the llama pattern as well. So again, look in the description if you're interested in reproducing this project. The holes are just in a slightly different location from where the 4 holes are on the shelf, and of course they're going to be much bigger. 2 of them are sort of over the holes, but 2 of them won't be. And I used a 1-inch drill bit here to drill the holes because we want those legs to be able to fit through them, and in fact we want the legs to have a little bit of movement inside them. And I did find this was easier with a corded drill as opposed to the cordless drill. And I also found it was easier if I had everything clamped down really well. Now I want to finish the legs before I put this together. The shelf will not be shown in the finished product, so we don't have to do anything with the shelf. But the legs, they have, at least the ones that I bought, kind of a sticky price tag on them. So I removed the price tag and then I sanded them down a bit. And now what I'm going to do is paint them. You could stain them. I'm using paint as stain, and I thought the easiest way to do that was to insert them back into the rubber pieces so that I could stain the whole thing all at once. So what I have here is some burnt umber paint with a tiny drop of black paint mixed in. These are acrylic paints, and then a lot of water so that I can use this basically as a stain. And I just put that over all of those plungers. And then I tried finishing them 2 different ways, which seemed pretty equivalent to me. One was easier than the other, though. One way I finished them was to spray them with a satin sealer, and that took a lot of coats. The other way was I just used a matte Mod Podge over them, and it gave me a similar look to the satin sealer, but it was just 1 coat, and it was easier to apply than the spray varnish. Now, with those finished, we're turning to the rubber part, and I thought it would be easier to attach these to both of the shelves using the rubber as a sort of gasket. So what I'm going to do is cut the part that the threaded part screws into, and then I'm going to cut another part to just go around the leg. So I want to stay fairly close to the center of that rubber piece and cut off 2 pieces that I'm then going to use to attach this to the shelf. So it's basically going to act like a gasket. And for both pieces, I do want them to have an empty center, so I want the wood to be able to come through both pieces. But so I did that for all 4 rubber pieces of the plunger. Created basically 2 discs that will fit over the wooden part. Now, I initially thought the legs would go straight up through one shelf and then attach to the top shelf. So initially what I did was I glued the rubber to the top shelf, and then I slid the other rubber pieces down the legs, put them through the bottom shelf, the one with the holes in it, and then glued them to the rubber and the top shelf. Now the llama slips between the 2 shelves. So the shelves are the structural part of this table, and the llama is sort of a decorative piece inserted in the middle. So I inserted the llama in there, kind of held that bottom shelf tight against the llama, who is upside down here, and then glued those rubber pieces to that bottom shelf, so holding basically the shelf and the legs together. But this really did not make a sturdy table, and I considered various ways of trying to make the table sturdy with this configuration. But then what I settled on, and this worked pretty well, was bringing those 4 legs together at the top. So it was actually very easy for me to remove that top shelf after I had glued it to the rubber. But you can see the glue is still on it. So I brought them all together, making almost like a tripod, except there's 4 legs, so a quad pod, I don't know. And this was tricky. Just the whole thing was kind of fiddly, and I think a second set of hands would have been helpful. But basically, I got them all together like that, and then glued the top shelf to them. And that's just to hold them in place while we drill through the top shelf into each of those 4 legs. So to hold this together permanently, what I'm going to do is drill pilot holes through that top shelf into each of the 4 legs, and then screw screws down into each of the 4 legs. So this required, basically I would just try to get the angle of the drill the same as the angle of the leg, and drill my pilot holes, and then again, trying to get the angle correct, screwing my screws in. And these screws that I'm using are drywall screws because that's what I had that was the right length. All of my wood screws are kind of short, and these were about, I think, 1.5 inches, the drywall screws that I'm using here. But that worked pretty well, and it was pretty sturdy now. So what we're going to do now is fill it in. And I also considered several different ways of filling it in. One way is to fill it in with cardboard. And you might have noticed there were some plastic bags stuck in the top of the llama for many of these steps. Another thing I was considering was stuffing it with plastic bags, because I do have a lot of plastic shopping bags, and then paper mache over it. I was considering using like a gauze bandage over the whole thing, trying to paper mache it that way. But then I decided that I would use this stuff which is called Great Stuff. It's a crack filler. So the sort of thing, like if you have cracks around pipes, or just, where a pipe comes into the house and the hole is a little bit bigger than the pipe, you might spray some of this in. It's an expanding foam. This is fairly inexpensive. It's under $5 a can. And my llama took 2 cans, I'll say plus, just a little bit more, because I wasn't very patient. But I found it very difficult to use a can after the foam had started to dry. I did not use the instructions on the can, or I tried that, but I didn't think it worked very well, which was to sort of bend the straw back and just stick it on the can and then cut off the end that had foam in it, because the whole straw was full of foam. So I wasn't sure how that would work. Another thing you can do is take the straw off the can and clean it with acetone. So just drip some acetone through it, like a nail polish remover that's 100% acetone. And I did that with another can, and that worked better, but I think there was still some foam that had dried in the can itself near the tip. So I'm not sure what the best way is to reuse these cans. I'm not sure it's really possible. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is maybe you could fill in the llama with more cardboard before doing the foam, and then you would use less foam that way. So that's another thing to possibly try. Now with these cans, the instructions say to wear gloves and eye protection. You might notice I'm wearing a respirator. I wear a respirator because I think there's no harm in wearing a respirator. So the can does not say you have to wear a respirator when you're working with this stuff. Now what I would recommend is go slowly, and you just spray it in. You shake it up for a minute and then spray it in. But it does expand, and it expands quite a lot. So I think if I had found a way to give it time to expand, that I wouldn't have needed more than 2 cans, because there was a lot of overflow. So if you could spray in a little bit, let it expand, then spray in a little bit more, and do it incrementally like that, maybe it would only take 2 cans or even less than 2 cans. Now the can says it takes 8 hours to cure, but when I started cutting it, it had been at least 12 hours, and it was still a little bit sticky on the inside, so I would recommend giving it a little longer than that to cure. But what I now want to do is to trim it back to the cardboard, and I'm using my little saw that came with a little saw and miter box, and I'm using that because it says to cut it with a serrated knife, and this little saw is serrated. So again, I just trimmed it back to the cardboard, and I would say trim it a little bit at a time. It's much easier to just sort of shave it off a little bit at a time rather than cutting big chunks. And I would also say trim it as much as you can this way. You can also sand it, but it's actually not that easy to sand. So I would say, trim it back as much as you can. Here I am sanding it with my mouse sander, and maybe it was difficult because the grit that I'm using is an 80 grit. I had run out of 60 grit sandpaper. So a 60 or maybe a 40 even might have worked better for sanding it, but all I had was an 80 grit sandpaper. So I sanded back the foam, and then this was just a sort of lather, rinse, repeat process where then I added more foam and cut it and sanded it. Now, one other thing I wanted to try was to make paper mache out of the shavings that were left from the foam, and the shavings alone with glue, white glue, did not work well. So what I'm doing here, and I am using my paper mache blender, this is not a food blender, but I'm putting in bits of the foam, which I shaved off of the llama, and then some tissue paper, and I also tried some tissue paper and some newsprint, blending that up with water, and then pouring it out of the blender, squeezing as much water out as I can, mixing it with some white glue, and then applying it to the llama in the remaining cracks. This is definitely easier to manage and easier to get the finish that you want than the foam. I really like the foam, but I thought paper mache might actually be better for just the finishing touches, filling in the cracks, getting it a little bit smoother. And I think even just plain paper mache would work, but the paper mache with the foam in it was pretty strong paper mache. Now the only disadvantage to this is that it is still quite damp, and I've worried a little bit about it getting the underlying cardboard structure wet. It doesn't seem to have done any damage, but I was concerned about that. And it did take a long time to dry. But then ultimately what I did, you can see here, was I went back with that third can of foam, not a full can, but some foam, and continued to fill in cracks with the foam, and then of course cut and sand. And that's the first stage of creating our llama. Once this is done, we have a pretty sturdy table with the llama form inside.
So what do you think of our llama side table so far? He is moving on to phase 2, which I will bring to you next week. Unfortunately, this project is taking a really long time, so I am going to have to bring it to you over 2 weeks. But I'm pretty pleased with how it's turning out so far. He is a little crooked, but so am I. So I'm going to forgive that. And I have a surprise for you. I made 2. This one's still in phase 1. He needs a little bit of trimming. But next week, I have 2 different ways that I want to try to cover these llamas for 2 completely different looks. And I'm a little nervous about it, but pretty excited. This one, at least, isn't quite as lopsided as that one. So The other reason I'm excited about this one is I made this one from the pattern, and they both came out basically the same, so that gives me some confidence in the pattern. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.